So, welcome everybody to my talk about directive composition in Angular. So first of all, a big thank you for Adi for organizing this awesome conf and giving me the opportunity to speak here. And before I dive into the topic, I quickly want to introduce myself. My name is Kevin, as Adi said, Kevin Kreuzer. So he did a pretty good job there because usually English speaker call me Kreuzer, but let's just stick with Kevin. That's totally fine. As I said, I'm a freelance front-end engineer from Switzerland. I am also a Google developer expert in Angular and web technologies. And whenever I don't work on the client code base, I love to share my knowledge. So therefore, I maintain a blog post on Medium. I'm also the author, or I maintain a YouTube channel where I talk about Angular and front-end stuff. And I'm also the author of various open source projects, which you can download and find on NPM. I'm also very excited about the latest project that I'm working on, which is AngularExperts.io. So you will see Thomas Troyan, which is a good colleague of mine, who also gives a talk here. And together we kind of built this platform, AngularExperts.io, where we publish workshops, services, or new blog posts. So if you are curious and want to learn new cool Angular stuff, then visit AngularExperts.io. Also, in case if you have any question regarding this talk or just want to chat about front-end stuff, feel free to reach out to me. You can find all my personal info and contact data on imkevin.ch. Also the links to my Medium blog, YouTube channel, and to some of my open source projects. So, but enough of me. Let's go to the more interesting stuff, which is Angular 15. So by now you should already know that we recently got a fresh release of Angular, which is Angular 15. So we got it by the end of November. And whenever we get those new Angular those new Angular releases, we get a bunch of great features. And it's the same for V15. So V15 contains tons of bug fixes and new features. And I made a list of my favorite features. So one of the favorite features is stable standalone APIs. So in V14, we already got standalone APIs, but they were development preview. Now in V15, they are finally stable and we can start using them for production. So that's pretty cool. Also, in previous version, we already got some of Angular's core as standalone. So ng4 or ngIf, we could already use them as standalone, which should optimize the bundle slightly. And now we also can use the HTTP client standalone by using the provide HTTP client method. Another highlight, of course, was the talk that we've just seen previously, which are image directives. But for me, I'm often writing UI component libraries. So whenever I work for my clients, I'm mainly writing UI component libraries, so something similar to Angular Material. And therefore, for me, my personal highlight is Directive Composition API. And that's also why I chose this talk. And as Adi already spoiled us a bit, Directive Composition API, I'm not the only one that is so excited about this feature. It's actually the whole community that is really, really excited about Directive Composition API. Because Directive Composition API originates from one of the most popular Angular issues of all time. So that's pretty cool. It's also I also want to take this as a chance to say thank you to the Angular team, because it's pretty cool that the Angular team listens to the community and then also provides features that the community really wants. I know that this is not always possible because they also have like their roadmap and need to prioritize things, and there are a lot of things that the community wants. But it's pretty cool that we as a community have a say in the direction of Angular. So the issue that I was talking about is this issue. And if you check the title of the issue, it's actually a very nice summary of the Directive Composition API and of its capabilities. So it's basically a proposal to have the ability to add directives to host elements in component declarations. So that's actually the summary of the whole Directive Composition API. Of course, I will not finish now and say like, that's it. So I thought of a small example that will show you in detail how Directive Composition API works and how we can use it. So I created a small application, which I call a digital pinboard. So it's just a small pinboard where you can hang on a bunch of pins. Of course, we have a board and a bunch of pins. Now, a demo code for such an application could look something like this. So we would have an HTML and we have a pinboard component. And into this pinboard component, we project a bunch of pins. We just simply use ng4 to loop over those pins and then also use an image input to display the image of the pin. In our TypeScript code, this would just be, we would just declare an array of pins, which are just a string array. And this is basically the image name. So pretty straightforward and nothing special so far. So probably at this point, you are pretty excited about the World Cup. It's Friday, you want to finish, you want to go and watch the next game. And then your manager approaches and says, yeah, okay, hold on, because your pinboard looks great, but we need some additional features. So the pinboard looks nice, but each pin should have the possibility to be initially rotated. Furthermore, each pin should be draggable, and we also want to display a nice tooltip on hover. So our PO requests us has a request for 3 more features. So the first feature would be an initial rotation of the pin, then a draggable pin so that we can drag and drop the pins on the pinboard, and also a tooltip. So how do we implement those features? Let's think about it. So the first thing that comes to mind is that we just go ahead and implement all of those features right into the pin component. So we can implement the draggable, tooltip, and the rotate directive inside our pin component. That would work, but it has a couple of downsides. Imagine if we now do like another feature another component that also wants to display a tooltip. I think in that case, it would be better to extract this logic into something reusable. So what we could do is we could go ahead and add fresh directives. So we could add a tooltip directive, a rotate directive, and a draggable directives. And all of those directives take care of the functionality and can be reused in our application. So we extract basically the logic and offer some sort of composition. And there's a third option, which is maybe in our repository this functionality already exists. So maybe we already have some directives, some tooltip directives, or some draggable directives, or a rotate directive. And as you can imagine, for this talk, because I don't want to watch you how I implement all those directives, so therefore we already have a rotate directive, we already have a draggable directive, and we already have a tooltip directive. So cool. So this should be pretty easy to achieve. We have all the directives in place. So what we can do is we can basically extend the definition in our TypeScript code. So we have our pins array, which previously was just a string array, but now we refactor it into an array of objects. And each object has a rotate attribute. So that's basically the input that we need for the rotate directive, a tooltip attribute. So that's the input we need for the tooltip directive, and then still an image name. So that was previously the string value. Once we refactored this, we also have to adjust our HTML. So now our HTML looks a bit more complex, but it's still pretty straightforward. So again, we have the pinboard and we project a bunch of pins. Now on the pins, we still loop with ng4, but we now apply our directive. So we first apply a draggable directive. And whenever we apply the draggable directive, we also pass a drag zone as input property, because we only want our pins to be draggable within the pinboard and not outside. We get a hold of the drag zone by using a template ref. Then we also have 2 output bindings, drag start and drag end. And we use those output bindings to then display a text. So basically, if you drag a pin, we show dragging, and otherwise we just say drag a pin to update its position. And we also apply the rotate and the tooltip directive. Those are a bit special because they directly require an input. So we apply them and pass the rotate input or the tooltip input to them. So that's cool. So now we have all the features that are required by our product owner. So basically we are done. But there is some room for improvement. And with the current situation, it's kind of cool because we have maximum flexibility. So whenever you use the pin component, you can use it with draggable pins. You can use it with pins that have tooltip, or you can use it pins that are only rotated and cannot be dragged and don't have a tooltip. So it's basically up to you as a developer to compose those features. So that is on one side, it's pretty cool. On the other side, it would be cool if we could provide this all out of the box. Because now the consumer of the pin component, so you as a developer, you are responsible for applying the correct directives. And that means that you basically need to apply those directives every time you want to use the pin component with this set of features. So if you forget to apply those directives, the pin component will not behave in the same way. So this can be cool. It depends on use case. For some use cases, this can be very nice. For some, maybe you want to have a different behavior because you want to deliver all those features right out of the box. So wouldn't it be cool if we could add the directive features directly to our pin component? Well, actually, that would be kind of cool because that's what we want here. So let's think about how we can achieve this. And the first thing that probably comes to mind is inheritance. So what we can do is we can take our pin component and extend the draggable directive. Okay, that looks nice, and it has the benefit that we inherit all the Angular features. So we would get host bindings, host listeners, inputs, outputs, all this stuff we get. It also works great with template type checking, so seems to be pretty cool. But here we have like some downsides. And one of the downsides is that the public API can leak into derived classes. So whenever we extend the draggable directive, everything that is public API on the draggable directive automatically becomes public API on the pin component. And maybe we don't want that. Maybe we want to have only a couple of inputs available for the pin component because we have a special use case or something. So the draggable directive is very generic, but maybe we would need to kind of limit it for the pin component. And there's currently no way of doing this. And with that, we could probably still live, but there is like a real, a bigger issue here. And the bigger issue is that we can only extend one class. So what about the rotate and the tooltip features? Like, how do we get them? This is not really possible with inheritance. And that's exactly where host directives come in. So with host directives, or with directive composition API, we can basically we can extend the behavior of multiple directives. So extend is maybe not the right keyword, but we can basically get the same behavior, the behavior of multiple directives. And to use host directives or directive composition API, we first have to understand how the API looks. So directive composition API introduces a host directives property on the decorators of a component and the decorators of a directive. And the API looks in the following way. So we can use the host directives property and we can pass in a directive directly, or we can pass in a configuration object which accepts a directive, inputs and outputs. So you're probably curious what this means and what the difference is. And to show you that, we now want to try out how we can basically move from the code that we've just seen. So from the pin, we have the pinboard with the pins and all the directives applied. So how can we move to host directives? And what kind of hurdles do we encounter on the way? So let me quickly share my IDE, and you can see the code that we've already seen on the slides. We also have a running application where we see the pins that are rotated. Also, when we hover pins, we see that the tooltip appears and we can drag the pins. Whenever we drag a pin, we see here on the bottom a dragging, and when we drop it, we see another text, drag a pin to update its position. So we have a nice running application. Now, let's try to use Directive Composition API. To do so, we have to open up the pin component. And then we go to the component decorator, and now we can use host directives, which is a property now available since Angular 15. And what we can do here is basically we can use the rotate directive, the tooltip directive, and also the draggable directive. Good. So that's it basically. So we successfully applied some host directives. Let's see it in action. So we get a bunch of compilation error. And this is the first thing that is important to notice whenever you want to use Directive Composition API, is that you can only use Directive Composition API or host directives when you have standalone directives. So the Angular error we get here is pretty nice because it tells us host directive, rotate directive must be standalone. So, okay, that's the first limitation when you want to use this API. So let's quickly go ahead and convert all of them into standalone. So again, we go to the component decorator and we add standalone true. Then we do the same for the tooltip directive. So we add standalone true. And we do the same for the draggable directive, of course. And standalone true. Once we converted them into standalone components, we also have to update our add module. Because, of course, we cannot no longer declare them, but we can import them since they are now standalone. Now, this should fix our app and it successfully compiles again. Cool. But if you paid close attention, you maybe noticed that something is broken now. So our pins are no longer rotated. The pins appear straight. So probably the tooltip is also broken, right? Yeah, kinda. So we hover, we get a tooltip, but we don't get a tooltip text. And as you might guess, the drag and drop behavior is also gone. Also, the text is no longer updating. So why is that? And that's the second thing that you need to be aware when you work with host directives. So it seems like a bug initially, but it's actually a pretty nice feature of host directives. Because by default, all the inputs and outputs are hidden. So this gives us the control to control our public API. And that's very nice. So let's go ahead to our pin component. And now we want to take advantage of the object configuration. So instead of just passing in the rotate directive, we will now use an object with directive, which is the rotate directive. And if you remember, there was an inputs property. And this inputs property allows us to say which inputs of the rotate directive we want to make publicly available. So we can control the public API here. So now we can say, okay, for the rotate directive, we want to make the rotate attribute publicly available. So let's quickly leave the tooltip and the draggable for the moment, and let's see if that works. Now we see that the pins are again rotated. So let's quickly go ahead, and of course we will do the same for the tooltip. So we add a public tooltip, and we do the same also for the draggable directive, and there we had an input named drag zone. So let's get maybe only here, something like this. So we now have a nice API. So we have a rotate directive on our pin component, and we want to make the rotate property publicly available, a tooltip directive, and the tooltip property is available, and the same for draggable directive. So now, again, we get a tooltip. We can drag and drop the pins. So there is one last thing missing, and that's basically the output. So we don't get, the outputs are not updated. And as you might guess, it's the same consistent behavior as well for outputs. So outputs are also hidden by default, and now we expose drag start and drag end as public API. Also, nice GitHub Copilot auto-completion, that's very helpful. So now when we drag, we see that our text is nicely updated again. So that's pretty awesome, I would say. So this is a very, very nice feature. Now there is one last thing that I want to show you for host directives. And that's basically, I am a big fan of clean code. So writing like maybe sometimes too much, but let's quickly check out our app component. And now in the app component, we read through, we have a pinboard, pin, rotate, tooltip, kind of makes sense. And then we have drag zone, drag start, drag end. So maybe for me, it would be cooler to speak here instead of drag zone, to speak of pinboard maybe. Then I know what to pass in, because otherwise I'm not sure what I actually have to pass. Like, it's not bad, but it would be cool. Also, those output events would be cool to have a different name. So Directive Composition API allows us to alias those things. So let's check the draggable directive. Now we have drag zone, and we can say we want to alias it to pinboard. And this alias syntax is basically the same that we already know when we destructure arrays. So we can also do the same for drag start. So we can say pin grabbed, and drag end, we just say pin dropped. Now in our app component, of course, we have to adjust. So instead of drag zone, we now use pinboard. And then here we say pin grabbed and pin dropped. I think dropped it was, yeah. And you notice that the ID, at least I'm using WebStorm, and currently it says that he underlines it red, but this is actually valid code. So also it compiles, and we can see that now everything works. So we can drag them, we can drop them, the texts are updated, the events are correctly fired. So this aliasing is a pretty cool approach to make it like more specific to your context. So currently we used it for our own directives, but of course you are not limited. You can also use Directive Composition API to apply third-party directives. So let's look at this example where we implement a My Button directive, which is an attribute selector on buttons. And we want to use a tooltip as well. So we can import mud tooltip, and we can then also alias the mud inputs, because of course when they come from material, they are prefixed with mud, but probably you don't want to prefix everything in your application with mud. Or maybe you even have like some convention that you prefix your stuff with your company prefix or something. So you can do that with aliasing. And also you can then apply multiple of those directives. So let's quickly summarize what we've learned here. Directive composition has a bunch of advantages and I think it's a pretty cool feature. I hope that you now see like the advantages of it. So one of the cool things is we can apply as many directives as we want. So there are no limitations. It can be either our own directives or it can be third-party directives. Then the next cool thing, and this is something that I really, really like, is that we get full control over the public API. So we can basically say what we want to make available for our component and what we want to hide. So by default, all inputs and outputs are hidden. That is something that you just have to keep in mind when you start to work with this API. It also works great with template type checking, and all the Angular features work, so such as host binding, injection tokens, and so on. Another cool thing that I haven't used yet, but you can basically chain those directives. So you can have a directive or multiple directives, and then use host directives on one of those directives, and then use this directive again in another host directive. So you can chain those things together. And another cool thing is the thing that we just saw when we renamed the drag zone to pinboard, is that inputs and outputs can be aliased to better fit to the applied context. There are also a bunch of limitations or just things to be aware when you start working with this API, is that you can only use it when you use standalone directives. So that's one thing to be aware. But I think like the Angular error is so precise that even if you forget this, you will be reminded very quickly. This is another thing that we haven't seen now in the example, but whenever you start to use host directives, you can only use one directive once. So this is probably not, it's very easy to avoid, but it could be a bit more tricky once you start to chain directives. So if you have those chains, a directive also has to be unique within a chain. And last but not least, a component cannot be used as host directives. That's another last limitation. So if you like this blog, this talk, then I would also recommend you again to check out our Angular Experts IO website, because there I basically have written a blog that is almost the same that I just showed you, just in a written version of it. So maybe you want to go again and just check out and go at your own pace and read it through, or maybe you just prefer a written version, then feel free to check out this blog there on angularexperts.io. So that's everything from my side. Yeah, again, big thank you to Adi for organizing this whole conference. Also, let's stay in touch. I'm best reachable on Twitter. So if you want to follow me and reach out to me, feel free. Yeah, thanks a lot.